And so moving on to learning targets and looking at our assessments today, I always hear the term teach to the test. And people hate the term teaching to the test. But what gets me riled up is when I hear people say, well, that's just going to make me teach to the test, and I'm only teaching to the test. Well, shouldn't you be teaching to the test? If the test is assessing what it is that you're teaching, you are teaching to the test. And there's nothing wrong with that. As Dufour say, teaching to the test is a perfectly appropriate and honorable thing to do, particularly when the test represents a valid assessment of the student's acquisition of meaningful knowledge and skills. It's an acceptable thing to do. And so how do you align what you're doing with the students in the classroom with your assessment to make sure that you are going to teach to the test? So we're going to look at learning targets today and how those align with your assessment. And it's really important that we assess standards that are important to meet the 21st century demands that our students have. And so maybe in the past that hasn't been a focus. It's been the certain content that they need to know instead of those skills that they're able to perform and the processes that they're able to apply to that content. And so making sure we're assessing appropriately to meet the 21st century demands that students have. And today we're going to talk about applying a set of criteria to your selection of standards or targets to assess. So how do you know which targets or standards you should be assessing? Do they meet these criteria that have been put in place to help you select those? And we always say that we assess what we value. Okay. You might look at an assessment and it might show a predominance of one standard over another because that's what that teacher values. That's what that teacher thinks is important. But if we assess what we value and we're going to prepare them for the 21st century, which we're already 14 years into, and we keep talking about 21st century skills, we need to value what prepares students for the future. And so as we write assessments, we need to keep these things in mind. So we have a handout for you today, and the handout is entitled Criteria to Identify Standards and Learning Targets for the Common Assessment. And so when determining which assessments to use, which standards to use with your assessment, you need to take a look at these 6 things. So, is that standard or target important to the student's future? Or is it important to the discipline? Well, of course, every target or standard is important. But which ones are important at this point in time? The standard or target has leverage, which means that it represents enabling knowledge and or skills that students are going to be able to use. It's appropriate. It reasonably represents what the student can do at a given point in time relative to the purpose of the assessment. Is it clear? Meaning the standard has been deconstructed so that it can be turned into a learning target, and the standard is in a language the student understands. And I have an example for you with that clarity. Because if students don't know what their target is or what they need to learn, it's going to be more difficult for them to learn. They need to be able to understand what it is you're talking about, because if they read that Common Core standard, they may not understand what that says. So we have to deconstruct that and put it into a language they understand. So for example, drive a car skillfully. Now, growing up, if somebody says you need to be able to drive a car well, would we know all of those things that are involved in that before we actually learned how to do it? So to deconstruct that, you want to say, can you evaluate if you're being safe? And if you're not, synthesize information to take action quickly. That's one of those things that you need to be able to do in order to drive a car. However, for students, we need to break that down into a language they can understand. So I can decide what to do next based on my understanding of how cars work, what other drivers are doing, and road conditions. When in danger, I can figure out how to reduce danger. So that breaks it down more for what the student can do, and it helps them understand what that means when you say drive a car skillfully. Or perform driving actions automatically, like steering and merging. So I can keep the car going in the right direction when steering. This winter, a lot of people had a hard time doing that. I can merge smoothly and at the right time. That's still difficult for people these days on the highway. And I can drive well without having to think about my every move. I remember the first time getting into the car. Okay, put my seatbelt on. Okay, turn the engine. Oh, I've got to make sure my headlights are on. And okay, I'm going to turn this is the way I go for the blinker. Nowadays, sometimes you get so automated in driving and where you're going. Do you ever ask, how did I get here? I don't remember driving that this morning, because it has become automated. But for young people, when they're first learning to drive, everything is thought through very precisely to remember what you need to do. But this is an example of breaking down what it is you want to assess a student on into those skills, and then in a language that those students can understand. Is it measurable? The standard has been turned into a learning target that contains a verb that accurately represents the type of thinking, performance, or disposition desired. Can you measure what a student is doing? Instead of saying, I want my students to be creative, how do you measure creativity? Is there a measure in place for that? Or is that too nebulous that you need to rewrite that, and so you're able to measure that in an assessment? And then balance. This is always the tough part. And we're going to get more into this on our second day together. But the collection of targets selected for one common assessment, or for a collection of common assessments for one grade and one academic year, represent a variety of target types. For example, we are not unwittingly selecting a majority of targets that represent knowledge only. So you have different types of learning targets. So are you selecting all knowledge? Or are you selecting all depths of knowledge from the same level? Or are you varying those levels within your assessment? Next time we meet, in about 2 weeks, little less, we are going to have a tool that's going to help you determine if you have too many targets from one area, if you're addressing all depths of knowledge areas and levels, and if you're looking at different types of learning targets. So that's something we need to be aware of as well. And this is a quote from Marzano. I won't read it to you. I'll have you take a look at it. So not only is it deconstructing those standards and learning targets and putting them into a language that students can understand, but it's also sharing them with the students. If students know what they're supposed to be learning, they're ahead of the game. Up to 27 percentage points higher than students who don't know what they're learning. It's not just posting them in the room either. because then we make the assumption that students are understanding what you've written. It's going through those learning targets with students to say, okay, this is our learning target. What does this mean? What is your understanding of it? And they have the ability to self-assess to say, yep, I know what that is, or I'm having trouble with it. So it goes beyond just having them or posting them in the room. And this is a piece where you make your targets measurable. So you have different target types. You have your knowledge, your reasoning, your skills, creating a product, or having a performance, or your dispositions. And you want to make sure that the method that you use to assess a certain target matches appropriately. And one of your pieces of homework that you'll have before next time we meet is to watch a video that gives you more information of how to match that target with the correct method of assessment. And so this is just for information only right now, but it does show you how those line up with each other. What questions might you have so far? Okay, so we're going to have you practice again. Now we know that you have been using smarter balanced release items that we've shared with you today just to get you going on looking at items and, evaluating something that someone else wrote. Because it's tough to look at our own stuff that we've created and do an analysis of it. But what I would like you to do is to take out your assessment items that you brought with you. Okay? And what you're going to do with this today is you're going to ask yourself, what's the learning target that I'm assessing on just one particular item? Just select one item. What's your learning target that you're assessing? And secondly, do those targets follow the guidelines? Are they important? Do they provide leverage? Are they appropriate for the assessment and the grade level and the content? Are they clear? Measurable? And then the balance, we don't need to look at that one today because that'll be looking at your whole assessment. But just start with one assessment item from the assessment that you brought. Identify your learning targets, run through the criteria, and share that with a partner. All right, we'll give you some time to work on that.